So my name is Tony Platt, and I'd like to welcome you to this session, What's a University For? The Role of Academia in Tumultuous Times. I can't think of a more important set of topics for those of us that are in universities to be discussing now and to engaging issues like this. I'd like to start off by thanking all the panelists who have agreed to come here and be a part of this. And my special thanks to the president of the American Society of Criminology, President Val Janis, and the program co-chair, Charis Kubrin, for accepting this proposal with enthusiasm and making sure that it happened. Often sessions like this at the ASC get pushed to the margins or to the early morning sessions, so very appreciative for the ASC for making this happen today. This is an extraordinary moment for an extraordinary panel. Not only is it unusual to have one or two men on a presidential panel, that's very rare. I can't think of a time when the ASC has had this composition of people here. Not only do we have a group of speakers who practice Edward Said's guidance, that as intellectuals, we need to imagine that the people we are writing and talking about, especially those upon whom bombs are falling, are reading and listening in our presence. This sense that scholars and activists who are on this panel today don't just do research, but they unite with the people that they're thinking about and talking about and writing about, which is an important and unusual activity in criminology. But also, it's extraordinary that the American Society of Criminology, unlike many universities and too many criminologists, symbolically commits itself with this panel to resisting and not collaborating with this extraordinary, dangerous moment in world history. So thank you all for participating in this conversation and this discussion. And I did a program for the event here with the bios of the people involved and who they are and where they come from, and so that you can have that in front of you so I don't have to take up precious time talking about the panel's biography. They might say something about themselves when they come up. But the organization of the panel is that Professor Nadra Shalhoub-Kevorkian is going to lead off with the presentation. Many of you probably know that she's been forced to leave Israel, who's a distinguished academic there for many, many years, a leading scholar in the field of criminology and law and society, and who has set an example for those of us who are trying to make the university into a place of opposition and controversy and discussion. We're very glad that she's here, and she's going to lead off the discussion. The only other change in the program is that Professor Nikki Jones from Berkeley has invited Gil Rothschild to join her in her piece of the presentation. They worked together when Gil was here at the university doing his doctorate degree, and she's invited him to share her time slot on the panel. Gil comes from the University of Haifa. He's somebody who's teaching now as an assistant professor, is in the middle of trying to act with integrity and fight for social justice in an extraordinarily difficult situation. So we're very glad that he's joined us at the last moment, and he's not only Nikki Jones' guest here today, but he's the guest of all of us. So please welcome Nadra Shalhoub-Kevorkian to give her talk.
Can we have the presentation?
It's over there.
Oh, it's over there.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's on the two screens.
Okay. Okay.
It's a good afternoon. It's the first time that I'm given the permission to narrate, as Edward Said said. And I'm here to discuss the political economy of death that sketches state terror. Stan Cohen said in his book, Against Criminology, criminology has often played an active role as an intellectual prosthesis of the state, providing both material and ideological support and legitimacy for expansion and exercise of police power and mass imprisonment. And this is Stan Cohen, 1988. When Jack Young noted the elective affinity between positivist criminology and the state is close, while feminists, black feminists, critical criminologists suggested to historicize and carefully theorize and well-map criminology. Native scholars in settler colonial context revealed the settler state's criminality, pointing to the way the settler colonial machinery with its complicity and complicit scientists and researchers turned the colonized land, the colonized home, the colonized life, the colonized body, the colonized scattered body into a genocidal zone of state criminality, penetratability, and rapeability. As many scholars and academics have argued in relation to colonial and settler colonial countries, their systems of governance are grounded in capitalist, imperialist, and patriarchal law-making principles that continue to shape the development of hierarchical systems through violence, social, political exclusion, oppression, economic exploitation, and control of culture. It's okay? All is good? Okay. Other settler colonial, like McGirr and Pales, argue that state-imposed hierarchy maintains the colonial tactics of domination by perpetuating the fragmentation of indigenous system, legal tradition, and culture through policies such as the Indian Act. Socioeconomic factors are interrelated with the criminalization and victimization of indigenous people by the westernized system of crime control and have led to overrepresentation in court and in prison. Kunin and Tauri indigenous people said indigenous people are more vulnerable and susceptible to victimization within the justice system due to the ongoing colonization, oppression, and associated legacy of traumatic experience. So on the theoretical level, we know that state criminality is hard at work in the settler colony. From a methodological perspective, by just reviewing some of the methodologies used by some scholars, anti-terrorism, lone wolf, anti-radicalization studies, we realize how the violence of theory and violence of methodology perpetrated against colonized natives who, in their ontological unfreedom and savagery, inhabit a state of political animality and terrorism. As humanity and freedom are indissociable linked in the vision of liberal empire, the native terrorist other necessarily remain locked in, as Feldman said, time and space of subjugation, exposure, disappearance, and abandonment. The colonial racial logic guiding both the methodology and theory that on the one hand mobilize all its energies to safeguard the freedom of the settlers, while conversely punishing the demands for freedom by those rendered landless and non-human within the unequal racial political landscape of the settler colony. This dialectic between political visibility and invisibility, life and death, freedom and unfreedom, achieves intelligibility within the academic game of colonial power, ending in over-policing, military governing, the bipolitical management of life beyond the edge of the human, to be killed or protected, held captive, or set free. Elkin points out that the brutal torture inflicted in Mau Mau fighters was not an aberration or breakdown of colonial rule, but its standard operating procedure, and I quote from Elkin, first in Palestine, then in Malaya, Kenya, Cyprus, Aden, Northern Ireland, and elsewhere, British coercive counterinsurgency tactics evolved, as did brutal interrogations and techniques. And if I will continue, I can bring India and I bring South Africa and so on. As a Palestinian feminist criminology, I'm living the ongoing genocide in Gaza, and I'm here to share with you my take, to ask you to wake up, refrain, and refuse from being an intellectual prosthesis for the state, as Stan Cohen said, and the criminal, not to the criminology of the state, and don't be the criminology of the state. If in Australia and Canada and other settler colonial entities, children were used as a capital in the hands of the state, as you know, the stolen generation and the collective graves that we've seen in Canada, in Gaza today, children are dead bodies scattered on the rubble. And they are my forensic space of criminological analysis. My talk will share some data to first engage you with Gazan children's coping with what they call in Arabic ashla, and explain why I see the genocide in Gaza as the culmination of unchilding. Second, I will invoke children's voices to explain what goes on, and I will conclude. But let me first start showing you, it's not moving. Data by the UN OCHA, UN Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. You can see what is going on in Gaza since October 7, 2023, how many Palestinians were killed, how many Israelis were killed, 1 million displaced in Gaza today, according to UN OCHA. And of course, this is the new report by Francesca Albanese, the special UN rapporteur. Acts of criminality, acts of state criminality in Gaza, converted from living spaces to death zone, turning living spaces to spaces of death. The ongoing genocide in Gaza, loaded with evidence of children's living, dying, and witnessing scattered, injured body parts and wounded flesh, posed the question of the political place given to the colonized body, evident in the Israeli state's overkilling, wounding, starvation, cutting fuel, displacement, and more, and apparent in the colonized scattered flesh on Gaza. In my talk, I use the Arabic word ashla to refer to the scattered body parts and dismembered flesh that is anxiously reiterated and repeated concept by children in Gaza, whose invocation of ashla helps to analyze their perception of its functionality and unpack the political work of its brutality. Borrowing from children's apprehensions, I theorize the politics of ashla and uncover the relations of the settler colonial imperial genocidal force and the deadly racial hierarchies in Gaza. Ashla, I argue, pushes beyond dismantling the biopolitical and necropolitical domain of the racial command in requiring us to read its inscription in the dismemberment, in the wounded and dying flesh body of the colonized. In doing so, my talk argues that ashla exposes the greedy appetite of the colonizer that prohibits the thinkability of Palestinian as oneness. You need to dismember them to be ashla. Its possibility to be and to constitute itself as a whole entity, rising above its uprooting and dismemberment. The turning of Gaza, Palestine into ashla, as Israeli politicians insisted, reveals the savage encroachment of power that facilitates settler colonial domination by preying on the decomposition of wounded and scattered Palestinian flesh. In this necro-economy, with its racial culmination in the overkillability, the local scientist political complicity is unveiled. Against the Palestinian genocide and the defiance of the scholarly silenced economy and necro-deliverability of ashla, Palestinian children are searching for life and continuity. In doing so, I argue that ashla as analytic exposes the greedy appetite of the colonizer and really takes us to new spaces of thinking and thinking of what is going. So let me just start with what goes on in Gaza, just to show you what is happening with doctors that are being displaced and disappeared, with those that are supposed to treat children that are being murdered, the systematic torture of doctors, the healthcare system that is dismantled. Of course, treating the trauma under the Israeli fire is really problematic and hard. And when we look at children's situation, we see that Save the Children have said that in January 2024, Gaza has more than 10 children a day lose a limb. So this is data that is shared. And as you can see, 17,000 Palestinian children in Gaza are unaccompanied, which means their parents are not around them. It would take 177 buses to carry the Palestinian children killed by the Israeli forces in Gaza. And if you will look at the 6 wars that those kids that today are 14, 16 years old, you'll see how many wars those kids have suffered and the way the state of Israel is treating them today. Of course, the amount of children imprisoned, and you can see the data by DCI, Defense for Children International, regarding children and their situation. What we see, what the data is showing me, what the data at least is telling me, is that unchilding, and this is the concept that I have used to talk about the fact that children are used as political capital in the hands of the state, and in this genocide, it's the culmination of unchilding. Unchilding aligns and operates with a twisted logic of necropolitics, whereby present and historical realities of who has died in the past, who gets to be born and alive, and who is left to die now, actually and symbolically, are inscribed on children's living, maimed, and killed body, children who are always already illegitimate non-subjects. Unchilding revealed that children are staged as an ontological other entity. So if we look, ontologically means that they are ontologically considered as non-being, yeah? Their maiming and killing do not provoke an ethical crisis to global political players, let alone to the settler state or its scientists. Unchilding maintains that children's bodies and terrorists dwell within are always and forever narrativized as child entities situated at the limits of justice, as Denise de Silva tells us. When unchilding is at work, maiming, wounding, and death are interpolated as if nothing happened. When these vestiges of violence, these children every day in that corner of the global space called Palestine, children are categorized as undeserving. When unchilding is made possible and reified as a mode of non-existence of this ontologically othered, unchilding's political power spreads beyond the geopolitical border. Unchilding facilitates the colonizers' extermination of indigenous life. It mobilizes the colonial machinery of destroy to replace, as Patrick Wolf have indicated. Unchilding as an ideology licenses and enables necropolitics, crosses geopolitical limits to reach the ethical border of every nation, mainly since it justifies the settler state's right to kill when and while maintaining no children are left there in Gaza. And these are the songs that are sang by the mobs in the streets. In such a culminative stage of mass murder, camp thinking is the organizing principle, managed via multiple discourses, among them state security, self-defense, biblical rights, national sovereignty, and scientific criminological support. The ongoing genocide in Gaza became a bodily, racially, and spatially inscribed necropolitics, determining who has legal rights, who can be exploited and penetrated, and who is unchilded. Unchilding operates profoundly through the disruption of the intimate that is embodied in the biopolitics, in the visceral, in the necropolitical, as well as through the global and local politics of denial. And here I remember, and I think again, of Stan Cohen and his way of talking about states of denials. Unchilding as a genocidal mean to kill or not actually kill a child or maim them, but rather to kill the possibility. Really, the mere possibility of being a child is what we also find today in Gaza. Consulting with the Convention of the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, Article 2 stated, A, killing members of the group, B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, 3, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, and D, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and C, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. killing the possibility of being and of being a child, as I wish to argue, is a critical strategy of the settler colonialism. Unchilding secures the legitimacy of the settler colonial hierarchy, for then the settler child will be able to dominate the unchilded one. Unchilding covers A, B, and C of Article of the Convention, hence the legal repercussions on the Israeli settler colonial system. Children's dead or about to die wounded bodies, the performative instrumentalization of the child's body to demarcate sovereignty, its effective and performative inscription of power through acts of public execution and dismemberment of victims and families, even in death, what Andrew Lance analyzed as corpse messaging, because that dead body is giving a message to the people, become a mode of necropenological unchilding that draws boundaries to demarcate who deserves a dignity in life and death and who is situated in an elementary space, even when a child. Corpse messaging through the bodies of the dead Palestinian children, the violence of the missing coffins, the bombing and the objectification of children's slain body led up to complete unchilding. The question remains whether their wounded flesh can challenge the limits of justice. Let me move to the second part of my talk. The political economy of death, apparent in the genocide in Gaza, is embedded in the production of Palestinians as terrorist others, where criminologists constituted a deliberate attempt to find scholarly, philosophical, appropriate language for expressing the ontological otherness of Palestinians and the ontological structure of the social world guiding their analysis and state actions when dealing with terror and terrorism. The political economy of death is furthered by sacralization of politics. Just read my books on when politics are sacralized. When the Bible, including the use of Amalek, which is someone that you need to kill, is invoked to evict Palestinians from humanity. The settler colonial capital, sacralized and securitized, desire for accumulation, the figure of the terrorist nation, men, women, and children, impelled towards a continuous growth and unlimited desire to violence as inherent to their nature, and hence the need to overkill the already killed. The genocide against Gazans and the Zionist preoccupation with the dead is in the past, in the present, and in the future. That is the future where states' rights to maim is not good enough. So if Jaspir Part talked about the right to maim, but to maim is not good enough. Biopolitics and demographic control is not good enough. Necropolitical regimes, as Achille Mbembe have said, and the political economy of life and death is not good enough. The settler colonial machinery produces a system that pushes the dead to bury their dead as the only mode of allowing the settler to enter life. In my analysis of the political economy of death, the dead plays a significant role in the settler colonial accumulation and genocidal dispossession. The political economy of death here means that the colonizer's goal, desire, and no, it's not a secret, but a clearly stated goal by Israeli politicians, is to live or build their lives through the dead, keeping the terrorist other as always undead. The trick or the secret here is that such necrological commodifying and fetishism allows making the dead appears alive and even threatening and dangerous. Such an economy raises the question around the rule of the dead over the living. Terrorist children are dead, but yet not dead. They are undead in the sense that they became scattered dead bodies, ashla, that managed to live as ashla. The philosopher Walter Benjamin, a German Jew living through the Holocaust, once warned that under Nazi regime, even the dead won't be safe. The dead are definitely not safe in Gaza. How ethical and scholarly is to engage with criminology and criminological work that built its capital for years on killability and death, and has affinity with death to accumulate funding, build research agenda, train and guide politicians and policymakers in policing terrorism, over carcerality, whatever they're calling it. Framing Palestinians as unworthy of living demonstrates the capability of death as a capital and the political economy of death to give awards, to maintain academic journals, uphold academic excellency, and much more. To think critically about anti-colonial criminology while keeping in mind three considerations. Number one, criminology, law and society, and other academic disciplines have played and continue to play a major role in framing, in formulating, and legitimizing a securitized and sacralized colonial racial economy of death. B, that such academic studies produced epistemic violence and antagonism that went beyond invisibilizing and sidelining other models of conceptualization and of knowledge to joining forces in maintaining the constant killability and death of the other and the otherized, and see that the economy of death domesticated academic institutions to become a liberal territory for whiteness and racism, unsettling and in some cases pushing to death the intellectual production of non-Western and racialized intellectual, as Maldonado Torres tells us. So let me really conclude by staging academic abolitionism against keeping Palestine and Palestinians as a crime scene, calling for academics to join efforts against such political economy of death. So, to conclude, if Southernist criminology requires us, and if critical criminology requires us to confront the power imbalance through a paradigm shift in criminology toward the focus on concepts of power and class between global North and global South, as Sayyid Hussein Alas explained to us, and he proposed that a criminology that focuses on the crime of the powerful. Indigenous criminology focuses on the idea of decolonization as a restoration and revitalization of indigenous knowledge and legal traditions, as Kunin and Towery explained. Afrocentric criminology, like Agostino, argues that decolonizing criminology requires to first stop being, as he explained, the discipline of control freak. That both political economists and criminologists theories have often misinterpreted and hypothesized surrounding class inequalities, social reactions to crime, and recognized the social and historical struggle of colonized African population as these experiences are interconnected with the injustice occurring in the rest of the world. My Palestinian feminist abolitionist theory does not rely only on studying incarceration, but also the reformation of a politics of emancipation. And yes, politics of liberation and emancipation, a form of emancipation specific to the racialized logic of law and democracy, such as interviewing the dead from the moment they are dead until the barrier to understand what is going, examining the way Palestinian graveyards became hotspots of state criminality, the way the occupation of the census reordered the governmentality of the colonized, and the militarization of education and policing of Palestinians' birthing body. My feminist abolitionist approach requires that we challenge the continuum, repressive ideologies and practices surrounding penal sites, such as Sde Teman, developing abolitionist critical resistance feeding forward into the foundation of Black Lives Matter, no borders, no one is illegal, no exceptions, those different movements, and like really to call for abolition of precarity and inhumanity. As Black studies scholar Fred Moten and Stephen O'Harney writes, and I quote, "What is, so to speak, the object of abolition? Not so much the abolition of prisons, but the abolition of a society that could have prisons, that could have slavery, that could have the wage, and therefore not abolition as the elimination of anything, but abolition as the founding of a new society." What I'm saying that criminology has been an important contributor to the empirical narration of how the state became carceral, and how the settler state became a killing machine. In my homeland, beyond the numbers of genocide, injured, missing, maimed in Gaza, the story of unending death and killability that we as society know little about, the depth of depravity exceeds the violence done daily, extends to families, communities, culture, which new Palestinian abolitionism is proposed. As a Palestinian feminist criminologist, my abolitionist approach suggests anti-necropenological global project and epistemologies of abolitions that are against the settler colonial criminology of death and are historically and contextually informed and carries an emancipatory struggle to pursue what Davis names the possibility of political alliance that will move us in the direction of transnational solidarity from Ferguson to Palestine to Christmas Ireland and so on. So I want here just to finish with the voices of Palestinian kids in Gaza. And this is a kid that is sleeping on his mother's grave, and he's going every day just to make sure that he can feel her love. And of course, of Lena. And Lena was the source of my thinking and analysis, because she kept on worrying about the Ashla, about the fact that her family might turn to Ashla and that she might be turned to Ashla. And she was talking to her cat, because the only person that can hear her, it seems that the world is failing to listen to Lena. So she was talking to her cat, begging her not to eat her as Ashla. So I hope that we all will remember that Lena's voice, and will remember that studying and calling and thinking as criminologists requires an abolitionist perspective that takes into consideration voices like Lena and will stop her unchilding. I'll stop here.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. My name is Christina Heatherton. I'm a professor of American Studies and Human Rights at Trinity College. I want to first give my profound thanks to Nadira for her comments, for being here today. I want to thank all the panelists who I'm so proud to be speaking with. I want to thank Tony Platt for bringing us together. I want to thank the ASC for making this panel possible, and I want to thank all of you for joining us. Needless to say, this is an extremely difficult moment to live in, let alone teach in. Here in the United States, we are taught to believe that the genocide of Palestinians is a regrettable, though forgivable matter of war, a mere excess, collateral damage. Teaching in this moment means naming the deaths with no reference, the murders that occur in the extreme passive tense, those killed without perpetrators. Hisham Aratani, a Palestinian student from Brown University who was shot, paralyzed, and nearly murdered in Vermont last fall, alongside his friends who were also shot, Kanan Abdelhamid of Haverford College, and Tassin Ali Ahmed, who is my student from Trinity College. Hisham described the discordance of Palestinian life in a recent article for the New York Times. He wrote, quote, "In the news, our militancy is presumed, our killers unnamed, and our deaths repackaged into statistics. Somehow, we die without being killed." This moment has illuminated how people can make peace with the brutal present by living in an idealized past or in a redeemed future. Those of us who study policing recognize how temporal assertions are always simultaneously spatial imaginaries. How one understands themselves in time can determine how they move through space and vice versa. For states to reconcile the lived present with an aspirational future, great violence, along with the threat of it, is often deployed to bridge the distance. In this way, states do not simply operate in a present tense in their comprehension of spatial boundaries, or in a past tense to authorize their spatial claims, or even in a future tense, imagining how things will be. Rather, I argue they function in a subjunctive tense, declaring how things ought to be, an aspirational order unrealizable in the present. They become arbiters of orders to be realized, guardians against activity that could become illegal, and protectors of populations deemed to be the legitimate occupants of space against those deemed illegitimate. In an earlier version of this talk, Nadira had invoked a woman named Noor, a woman who described how, quote, the streets of Khan Yunis, where she lived, are filled with graves, and the cemeteries are filled with tents. I want to discuss this desecration of time and memory that accompanies the military reorganization of space. I think this is important because the ongoing genocide is also an herbicide, where entire civilian populations and civilian infrastructures have been rendered legitimate targets, as the UN Permanent Observer for Palestine has deemed it. As Nadira and others have demonstrated, it is also a domicide, a systematic destruction of homes. With almost all homes in northern Gaza destroyed and nearly uninhabitable, it has become hard to think of anything but the rubble and the many bodies still buried beneath it. But destruction is never a singular act. It always holds the potential for alternative construction. And I want to think today about how space is both made and unmade. I'm trained as a geographer, and so I want to think about the physical and conceptual struggles for space being waged in Gaza at this moment and in US classrooms. I want to think today of roads, tanks, and teaspoons. In critical theory, we often say that every negation is an affirmation. Accordingly, the British-Israeli spatial analyst Eyal Weizman encouraged us to think of war, destruction, and the military production of space at present in Gaza. He suggests that we see every Israeli military tank that drives to a bomb site, every military caravan or supply truck, not simply as military transport, but as road builders. In the attempted destruction of Palestinian space, new roads are systematically being built by military means. Existing roads, including supply routes at borders, are being choked off. Paths are being redirected. New arteries are made to flow. This is the realization of a map that has already been imagined and constructed elsewhere. But though the Israeli state determines the operation of roads, the Palestinian geographer Hashem Abu Shama reminds us that they are not, quote, the only ones that are producing space. Such a view, he writes, quoting Doreen Massey, deadens space. Space is material, it is political, historical, and cultural. The Israeli settler road, he writes, quote, is concrete, a material and spatial manifestation made through practices like indigenous dispossession, institutional power of the law and military that is also conditioned by colonial and capitalist processes. But space, he says, is not fixed. Quoting Massey, he writes, you are not just traveling across space, you are altering it, moving on it, producing it. The relations that constitute it are being reproduced in an always slightly altered form. Negations, we say, can also be negated. For Abu Shama, the space of Palestine represents a map without guarantees. And here we come to the classroom. For all spatial claims require conceptual work. Edward Said noted that though, quote, the main battle in imperialism is over land, when it came to who owned the land, who had the right to settle and work on it, who kept it going and who won it back, and who plans its future, these issues were reflected, contested, and even for a time decided in narrative. As one critic has suggested, nations are themselves narrations. One need only consider the metaphor of Palestine as a so-called land without people for people without land to grasp this point. As the Palestinian poet and scholar Rafat al-Arir noted, quote, Palestine was occupied metaphorically long before it was physically and militarily occupied. This is what he compelled him to teach his students to, quote, write back. In a 2021 lecture from the Islamic University in Gaza, he asks his class of 60 students how many of them had ever been to Jerusalem. Only 3 raised their hands. He confirms that Gazans can't travel there due to the occupation, but he reassures his students, quote, "Believe me, when you go there, you will feel like you've been there hundreds of times because you've read about Jerusalem. In literature, Jerusalem comes back to us. When you read Tamim al-Barghouti, when you listen to him recite poetry, he takes you to Jerusalem. You live in Jerusalem. He takes you back to it. You liberate it for just a little bit of time. And there is hope if you can imagine a free Jerusalem, a free Palestine, and you will work towards that." And so he did. And perhaps as many in this room are aware, Rafat al-Arir was killed in an Israeli airstrike last December. He was 44 years old. The murder of scholars, teachers, and writers like Rafat exemplifies what the United Nations has described as scholasticide, the systematic destruction of the Palestinian educational system. But with schools, museums, archives, and libraries destroyed, and with every university in Gaza bombed, it may be more precise to describe it as an attempted epistemicide, the destruction of knowledge systems and the knowledge they generate. As the Palestinian historian Shireen Shakaleh reminds us, one of the first major targets in the Israeli bombing campaign in fall 2023 was the Central Archives of Gaza City. Such destruction is not just such physical destruction is also an attempt to sever temporal claims to space. For archives not only document the past, they lay claim to futures in which the materials will be used, futures which the archives themselves might desire to bring into being. Palestinian students recognize the spatial and temporal nature of epistemicide. In a viral tweet, one Palestinian student noted, quote, "They blow up schools, they blow up universities, they blow up our futures." I want to say that our analysis today is haunted by echoes. The voices of so many Palestinian scholars and intellectuals who have been murdered in this genocide or else forced into extreme conditions of violence, hunger, exile, disability, and grief, where writing is hard to prioritize. Palestine remains a red line for academics. While institutional space for anti-racism has broadly expanded, it has often done so at the exclusion of confrontations with Islamophobic and specifically anti-Palestinian racism. As Olafemi Taiwo outlines, insincere gestures of inclusion have not fundamentally changed the nature of our conversations about power. Furthermore, with nearly 80% of the professoriate in the United States being precarious, working in contingent, vulnerable, short-term, and underpaid positions with little to no research support, knowledge production in this country is embattled. People who might otherwise be brave are often too overworked to write an essay, contribute a reflection, write a poem. And as we see with the repression on our campuses, the firing of academic staff and faculty, and the unleashing of police and vigilantes on student protesters, the current situation in higher education is dire. These circumstances have conservatized already conservative fields. They condition scholars to be even more risk-averse than they already are. But if we are able to speak to the question of Palestine at this moment in any meaningful way, it is because we are building upon the research and drawing upon the courage of scholars who have often been summarily dismissed from the profession for work that's deemed too risky or too political. We benefit from their work and suffer acutely in their absence. I want to start to conclude here, because though we may talk about genocide and destruction, though we must talk about it, we need not do it singularly. The scholar Rees McCold has repeatedly made the point that allies of the Palestinian struggle can sometimes unwittingly reproduce the propaganda of empire by asserting a legitimacy and an imaginary of state power and security prowess that Israel would like to project, but that it doesn't actually possess. This was made evident about 2 years ago when Mahmoud Arda and 5 other Palestinians escaped from Gilboa prison, Israel's most fortified prison. said to be more secure than the Bank of Israel. After tunneling out of Gilboa using implements as small as tablespoons, Arda said he discovered a secret. Quote, "We wanted to tell the world that this monster is nothing but an illusion of dust. Some roads are made by tanks, and other paths are dug by spoons." This, I would argue, is the challenge of living and teaching in this moment. How can we attest to the securitized infrastructures with their world-destroying power, while also recognizing that empires of violence can and often simultaneously are empires of dust? Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Zeynep Gönen. I'm an associate professor of sociology and criminology in Framingham State University. And I also would like to thank all the panelists here and Nadire for your voice and Tony for organizing this panel and for all of you to being here. In the beginnings of her speech, Nadire talked about connections and cooperations between colonial and imperial projects of violence and domination. And as a student of world systems sociology, global historical sociology, global carceral studies, policing, and also as an immigrant, I'm always interested in trying to figure out the connections, parallels, relations around the world in different parts of the world. And especially at this moment when we are seeing the new projects, not the new projects, all the new, but the projects of knowledge production, dominating, coordinating the knowledge production, the role of university, academic freedoms, especially here in the US and around the world, centering Palestine, ongoing genocide, the knowledge production about that is really extremely important. And I'm really happy to be a part of this panel. However, here, what I'm going to be talking about is not Palestine, but a case from Turkey, which is not to the center, but maybe to bring in some different light or parallel light to what has happened in Turkey with respect to academics there and scholars there who were in opposition to Turkish state's policies. So maybe that will give us some more perspective to what is going on here and around the world. And the case I want to talk about is the case of Academics for Peace, a group of academics who started to think about collectively how to produce knowledge and how to react to Turkish state's violence against Kurdish populations. In 2012, they were formed, and in 2016, we as Academics of Peace have signed a petition called "We Will Not Be a Party to This Crime." I'm going to briefly talk about what the petition was about, but right after this petition, the Turkish state unleashed, the petition was about trying to force the Turkish government to stop its operations on the Kurdish region, on the war on Kurdish people, to push them to put people who are responsible of human rights abuses accountable, and also to start peace negotiations, which was halted. Of course, it immediately faced backlash, sparking a widespread witch hunt against the signatories. Even before its formal establishment, of course, Turkish Republic has been a project of religious and ethnic homogenization, systematically marginalizing, discriminating against, eliminating, killing non-Muslim and other ethnic minorities. And Kurds resisted to this agenda, and by the 1980s it has become a multi-layered movement, including a guerrilla war against the Turkish state. The PKK, Kurdish Workers' Party, have used the guerrilla tactics in order to fight Turkish state. And in around 2010, there was a peace process, and in 2015, the peace process halted, and Turkey started its war again on the Kurdish people, on the Kurdish cities. And during so-called security operations, Turkish state, we heard reports of widespread incidents of excessive force, killings, disappearances, torture, destructions of homes and cultural sites, denial of access to emergency medical care, food, water, basic needs. So we were witnessing once again the indiscriminate violence of the Turkish state on Kurdish people, claiming to eliminate terrorist targets. It was this that prompted the 2016 petition by Academics of Peace. We will not be a party to this crime. And starting right away, President Erdogan, and soon followed by many others, a widespread criminalization discourse and campaign ensued against the signatories. Erdogan accused the academics of treason and labeled them as dark forces. He stated, quote, "This mob that calls themselves academics are blaming the government, and these poor replicas of intellectuals unfortunately speak of the state engaging in a massacre. Also, all you so-called intellectuals, you are nothing but dark forces." In another speech, he called upon the judiciary to act. "I call upon all our institutions, everyone who benefits from the state but is now an enemy of the state must be punished without further delay." The judiciary immediately launched prosecutions against many of the academics who signed the petition. We were all charged under Turkey's anti-terror laws with terrorist organization propaganda. The Council of Higher Education, which governs the university system, then directed universities to conduct disciplinary investigations, which were soon followed by police raids on many academics' homes, resulting in dismissals, arrests, and detentions. And in 2016, another important event occurred in Turkey, which was the coup attempt. And after the coup attempt, the purge of academics even escalated. Among many other enemies of the state, signatories of the Academics for Peace petition faced expulsion from public service, being banned from taking up any office in public institutions or corporations, the confiscation of passports. In addition to those dismissed before the coup, more than 300 signatories, there were about 2,000 signatories for this petition, were expelled from public service through state of emergency decrees. They were forced to live a quote-unquote civil death, as a pro-government journalist called for, being deprived of their basic rights. While there was solidarity among academics from within and outside academic institutions, internationally and nationally, the arbitrary and divisive fashion in which retributions took place was effective on the assault on academic freedoms and Academics for Peace in general. This was far from the first attack to academics' freedoms and freedom of speech in Turkey. Restrictions on the right to publish and teach on sensitive topics, especially the Kurdish issue, or Armenian genocide has resulted for some people even prison time, and these topics are hardly even studied in many of the Turkish universities. However, the Academics for Peace petition marked a turning point. While previous violations of academic freedom had generally been sporadic and unsystematic, the government's systemic use of counterterrorism terror discourses, as a tool against dissent signaled a new era of repression on scholarship, on academics who are dissents, threatening academic freedoms on an unprecedented scale. Academia and university are, of course, neither inherently liberatory nor repressive. They are spaces for struggle over truth production and power. And as Cohen's States of Denial suggests, states engage in silencing strategies within the academia and universities to deny their atrocities, deploying multiple layers of policing and discipline. The repression faced by pro-Palestinian voices in Israel, students and faculty here in the US, in Germany, and elsewhere, or by pro-Kurdish voices in Turkey exemplifies how states attempt to silence the truth. And trying to reproduce universities as ideological state apparatuses, if necessary through violence. Legitimacy for this repression is often built through discourses of security and terrorism, aimed at stifling critical voices. Against such attacks and repression, individuals' commitment and courage to speak in participation in knowledge production that centers those who are oppressed and those who are experiencing the violence is important, very important. But it is also necessary to use our collective power, to build our collective power and solidarity. Thinking from the case of Academics for Peace case, I believe especially higher education unions where they exist, in institutions in which they exist, are going to be really important in the US, especially in the coming era. And to also find other ways of organizing that many of faculty, students, and staff are doing around the US is going to be really important. And the other important point that I would like to make is that as criminologists, it is really important to really raise our voices with respect to these security discourses, or as one of my colleagues says, security prose and terrorism, and really create a coherent response to this use of these two concepts in order to criminalize, in order to make impossible to talk of incredible violences that we are witnessing. So that's what I have to say about this topic. Thank you.
Thank you. So good afternoon. Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be alongside the panelists here, and thank you, Nadera, for your powerful, provocative, and necessary testimony and call to action. I'm here as a Black feminist scholar trained as a sociologist and criminologist in American universities. I've taught in the UC system for 20 years, since 2014 in the Department of African American Studies at UC Berkeley. I chaired my department from 2021 to 2024 in the wake of a global pandemic and an explosive yet short-lived racial reckoning in this country. A country where in 1951 and again in 1970, Black Americans charged genocide against the US government, and where Native American tribes across Treasure Island continue to articulate their experiences as a genocide that is yet to end. And I'll say here, we are sitting on the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ra'ahutush Ohlone people. It is from this standpoint that I listen and learn from the comments shared by Nadera and our panelists. I had the opportunity to listen to Nadera's powerful keynote at Berkeley 2 days ago for the inauguration of the campus's program in Palestinian and Arab Studies, where she presented an extended analysis of the killing and overkilling of Palestinian people and what they understand to be an unfolding and protracted genocide. Given the silencing that often accompanies state-sanctioned violence there and here, and I hope we are hearing the similarities and the common threads in the security prose and the threats that we academics as enemies of the state will be facing. I deeply appreciate your commitment to bringing the lived experience of Palestinian peoples to us and to the world, not only the suffering, as you say, but also in your work, the care work that's done in sites of suffering. So thank you. In the few moments I have today, I want to encourage us to think about our role as scholars, teachers, writers, mentors during tumultuous times. I'm not going to focus on what universities can do because we know that universities are conservative, repressive, and reactionary institutions. So what do we do? Professor Shalub Kevorkian's forensic analysis provides some guidance there. We gather, we collect, we commune. We also receive guidance from work rooted in the Black intellectual, Black radical, and Black feminist traditions that provide a blueprint for how to move forward. We can draw on powerful concepts like Du Bois's concept of abolition democracy and work that I see informing Nadera's analysis as well from Black studies, like Saidiya Hartman's concept of the afterlives of slavery. Think about the afterlives of settler colonialism. And we're never quite in the afterlife as part of the kind of key takeaways from Hartman's work. Christina Sharp's discussion of wake work as material and intellectual care work we do in defense of the dead and dying. Fred Moten and Stefano Harvey's discussion of the undercommons as a site of radical redistribution of resources in a university setting. And the defiant architectural imaginary of poet and writer June Jordan. And each of these are epistemologies and new grammars that challenge this lexicon of legitimacy that takes up much of the academic work in criminology. We can be insistent and unapologetic in our efforts to critique, dream, and create. We can refuse efforts on the part of the institution to extract our energy or capture our imagination, and they are after our imagination. We can choose to be in community and to borrow from Nadera's work to build worlds amidst the rubble, with those who also refuse to be used, ignored, discarded, displaced, and who insist on defying the death-making logics of institutions and nation-states. This is the work we've done in our department over the last several years during this tumultuous time. This work includes projects like the Abolition Democracy Initiative, and I won't go into detail for time's sake, but you can find some of this on our website. The Black Studies Collaboratory, which was led by Professors Lee Rayford and Tiana Paschal, which brought together artists, activists, and scholars to engage and collaborate in ways that amplified the intellectual, political, and world-building work of Black studies. And that work was funded by the Mellon Foundation, and foundations, I think, have an important role to play in this moment. The Band Scholars Project is a new project that we launched in the spring, led by Michael Cohen, Tiana Paschal, our current chair, Eula Taylor, and myself. And that project is imagined as an antidote to this authoritarian moment. We recruit speakers who are currently facing political persecution for their work in Black and ethnic studies, and we know these K-12 battles over book banning and DEI extend into higher education. That's the battle in front of us. We provide refuge for those scholars, and so far we've had 2 scholars visit with us, and we have another coming in February, and together we curate critical conversations to help us think about larger questions of history, freedom, and democracy. And so again, you can read about that work on our website. Over the last year, our department, faculty, and graduate students have also hosted or co-hosted a number of events, from teach-ins to poetry readings, that have provided more space than has been allowed in classrooms for conversations on the devastation experienced in Gaza and the West Bank. So in the spirit of holding space for scholars, I want to share the remainder of my time with a former student, Gail Rothschild Ayasi, who received a PhD in jurisprudence and social policy at UC Berkeley and is currently an assistant professor at the University of Haifa.
Thank you, Nikki. Thank you, Nadera and Tony, fellow panelists. Thank you, everyone, for being present. It's very good to be here. The genocide must stop, and it needs to stop before I can seriously talk about anything else. I do not claim to know how this can be done, but I have a clear sense that we cannot do this by holding on to our established notions of individual selves, of security, of expertise. We need one another in different ways. We need new methodologies, new, old ways of seeing, speaking, and doing. We need courage. Courage to take risks, to come together, to let this moment radicalize us. In some tragic turn of events, abolition no longer seems like a radical futurity. For all the wrong reasons, the abolition of so-called liberal democratic institutions is well underway. We all sense it. This way of life that we are here sharing is coming to an end. But still, for many of us, this is mostly yet to come. Reality is stubborn. We go to sleep, we wake up, it is still here. And this presents us with a strong temptation to keep on walking our path. And of course, this is not the case for people in Gaza, for so many in Palestine, for many others right here. But this is the point, that our, so-called our way of life, our liberal notions of freedom, of agency, of subjectivity, have been secured through something foundationally untenable, outrageous, and deeply repressed. To be a bit more specific, our so-called liberal democratic institutions and the way of life they enable are built upon, as a matter of fact, a carceral notion of security. Whatever cannot be assimilated into freedom, agency, humanity, is partitioned and consigned to carceral territories, to reservations, to death, to prisons, removed from the category of the human, of liberty, and not less importantly, repressed out of existence, denied ontology, given no agentic form, no vessel from which to act, speak, be, let alone become. I want to make this point clear. Liberal democratic notions of security, law, and liberty are materially, if not ideologically, built upon a genocidal logic, on systemic removal of people and the cleansing of land and public domains, and on persistent denial and repression of this state of affairs. And this carceral colonial underbelly of liberal institutions creates the conditions for partition, for dislocation, dismemberment, the scattering of flesh, for what Nadra deftly conceptualizes through the Arabic word ashla. The relationship between Israel, itself based on a genocide, and Gaza is key. Without digressing into a history lecture, we can briefly say that Gaza, the so-called Gaza Strip, that is, not the city with its long, sometimes glorious, and tragic history, had gotten to this moment because it was made into a non-place, a black hole, where everything that could not be assimilated could be held outside of the world. Already in 1956, Hassan Knafani likened the sadness in and of Gaza to the sadness of holding an amputated leg and having to reattach it. And ideology aside, it is impossible to understand Israel apart from Gaza, which functions in the Israeli imagination and in Western politics and in military industry practices as a form of hell. Lech le'aza is a common Israeli expression, which literally means go to Gaza, and effectively means go to hell. I heard this phrase many times throughout my life, and I am ashamed to say that what it took for me to recognize that Gaza is part of my history, that Gaza and the Nakba are key for understanding that from the perspective of Europe, of Nazi Germany, of the British Empire, Israel was not created in the way that it was for the salvations of the Jews. It was created for the salvation of the Western interests. This can partly explain why we see today anti-Semites, even neo-Nazis, protesting side by side with staunch Zionists, swastikas and Stars of David aligned to protect Israel. I am deeply concerned with and affected by anti-Semitism, but please, do not think you are protecting Jews, me, by confounding anti-Semitism with critique of the state of Israel. My ancestors on my mother's side lived in Jerusalem, Jews, Arabs, Muslims, long before the state of Israel. And when Israel was established, they too, like the land, had to be cleansed from their Arabness, from their Jerusalemite Palestinian traditions. They were lucky to be Jewish, but the condition for becoming Israeli was that they do away with, repress their Jewish Arabness, their own Palestinian roots. Among many other things, the notion of absolute security, which the state of Israel inherited, has made this land extremely unsafe, also for Jews, and has robbed us all of our past and our futures. What does it mean to tell all of our stories through Gaza? And this logic of containment, cleansing, and denial is fractal. It is happening in Gaza, to be sure, but also in every aspect of our societies, in public discourse, in politics, in our psyches, in the media, in universities. In all these spheres, there is a continuous thrust to erase and to repress what simply cannot be seen. This points again to the need to let this moment radicalize us. And by this, I mean that we need not resort once again to well-established institutions. We cannot seek resource in established notions of knowledge and scientific or legal expertise. As criminologists, as social scientists, as different things with different skills, we need to come together to develop radical democratic ways of life that do not rest on partitioning, cleansing, and repressing. We need to go beyond carceral notions of security, which cannot make anyone safe in the long run, and toward forms of sociality and safety that rest not on looking away but on seeing together. I know this is abstract, but if carceral liberal orders are premised on segregation and cleansing, we need to reassemble. We need recognition, impurities, imperfections, interdependence, mutualities. This also poses a challenge to us as scientists, academics, in this moment, who are faced once again with the question of how to respond, how to act in such times. While Max Weber is often cited on the question of scientific objectivity, I think variably misread, I want to end with a passage from Du Bois's memoir, Dusk of Dawn. Du Bois writes, "At the very time when my studies were most successful, there cut across this plan, which I had as a scientist, a red ray which could not be ignored. I remember when it first, as it were, startled me to my feet. A poor Negro in central Georgia, Sam Hose, had killed his landlord's wife. I did not get there. On the way, news met me. Sam Hose had been lynched, and they said that his knuckles were on exhibition at a grocery store farther down on Mitchell Street, along which I was walking. 2 considerations thereafter broke in upon my work and eventually disrupted it. First, one could not be a calm, cool, detached scientist while Negroes were lynched, murdered, and starved. And secondly, there was no such definite demand for scientific work of the sort that I was doing. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you again for all my fellow panelists, for Tony for organizing this, and to Nadira for your ongoing bearing witness and conceptualizing Palestine for us and for so many others. I want to pose the question, how can we talk about genocide? And this is a question that I have been, and many of us have been, grappling with over the last year. And not only as scholars, as individuals, as professors and educators, as members of organizations, when we talk with allies, when we talk with friends, when we talk with family. Nadira's case of speaking up about genocide and the repercussions that it has brought for her was the most brutal form of the consequences of talking about genocide, but many others are bearing these consequences or keeping silent because of these consequences. In Academia for Equality, one of the organizations that I'm active in, that I'm on the board, and you can see some of our activities that were created specifically around Nadira's arrest and interrogation and silencing. Very few of us organized. It was a thing of minutes to stand in front of the police station where Nadira was interrogated. That was in Israel, so these were the colleagues in Israel, and other events that we organized around this particular case. But more generally, we are following the academic repression in Israeli universities. I am an assistant professor now at the University of Oregon. I come from, I'm originally from Israel, and for many years I've been a lawyer representing Palestinians and Palestinian prisoners particularly. I'm also an Israeli and international lawyer, and I've participated in the Palestine Solidarity Movement for a long time. So this talk represents the conversations that I had over the previous years in those multiple and intersecting sites. In the morning of October 7th, we all woke up to a reality that we haven't known before, and it was soon obvious that it was going to be a watershed moment, but I don't think we could have imagined to what extent it was. I lost a friend and a colleague that day who was a scholar, a political scientist, and an occupation resistor who was killed in his home in Kibbutz Cholit that morning, Chaim Katzman, who did his PhD at the University of Washington in Seattle, where I was at the time. But right after the initial shock, I started hearing things on Israeli media, and right after, I mean in the first week, that I never imagined that I would hear. Prominent media figures were talking about killing 1 million people, killing 100,000 people, if that's what it takes for Israel to be secure. And this thing was going on the media without any repercussions for the people who were talking about and preparing the grounds for genocide. And of course, I was very alarmed, and I felt that I had to do whatever I could to raise alarm to other people. And on October 15th, I posted on my Facebook, in addition to other things that I was doing at the time. It was only for friends, and I share this with you here in a bigger group. I'll read it out. 1 million bodies, there's no other way. I never thought I would hear these words on primetime Israeli media. It is both heartbreaking and risky to write this, but I feel obliged to sound all the alarms. The cruel and inhumane massacre that Hamas committed on innocent Israelis is clearly a horrific crime against humanity. Friends and relatives were slaughtered and taken hostage. Entire families murdered, and whole communities were wiped out. This came as a complete surprise. We are shocked and grieving, but what is yet to come could no longer be a surprise, and it is still preventable. We should therefore do everything to save the lives of innocent civilians, as well as Israeli soldiers. Throughout the years that I worked on documenting, challenging, researching, and writing about human rights violations by Israel, I was always firm in my conclusion that this is not genocide. I am horrified by the events of the last few days because the Hamas attack of October 7th is a watershed moment that may change this, and the genocide script is unfolding. And this started a series of conversations that I really didn't think that I would have, because people who were very close to me, and I considered them as political allies, responded in ways that I did not anticipate, saying, it is unfair to just now accuse Israel of genocide. How can you say, and how can you use this word? And this is what got me thinking about what is the way to talk about genocide, and how what was becoming really clear really quickly to me was not clear to other people that I considered allies. So one of the things that helped me, I think, realize that really quickly is my training as an international lawyer. And if we look at the Convention Against Genocide, we see that genocide is acts committed with an intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. So for an international lawyer, the intent is a main aspect of genocide, and usually it's the hardest to trace. But this case, it was the other way around. The intent was there even before the acts were there, or right with the acts, in a very open way. But soon I learned that people do not think in these terms that I am thinking about, and their thinking about genocide is through narrative, through context, through emotional connections, through cultural ideas, through collective histories, and personal memories and experiences. So I started to talk more and understand how people think and discuss genocide. So we know that, oh, sorry, I have two screens. So that is the post that I just read to you. And that is the Convention Against Genocide and the intent in it. There are a number of genocides in modern history, and when I started looking for those, I found out that many of them are displayed on the websites and the materials prepared by Holocaust museums. And many people think of genocide through a particular history, their own history, and the way that they have been taught this history. And the Jewish Holocaust was, of course, a primary one, though not the only one. These cases are so different from each other, but the most well-known is the Jewish Holocaust. And I want to raise the question of which of those is exceptional and why. Because many people think that the Jewish Holocaust is exceptional for various reasons, for the scale of it, for that it happened in Europe, or for the very efficient and modern ways in which it was carried out. But I want to argue that there's another thing that is exceptional about the Holocaust, which is that it is not controversial, or not to the extent that other genocides are controversial. And it is not necessarily because of the scale or documentation or historical work, but because Germany had taken responsibility for that genocide in ways that other perpetrator societies have not done so. So the fact of genocide being non-controversial is part of the way that people now understand genocide if their main paradigmatic example is the Holocaust, which brings many people to think if this was a genocide, we would know, like I know it when I see it, right? We would know right away. There would be no controversy. There would be no question marks. It would be obvious and clear to us. And since there are question marks, then perhaps it is not genocide. But this is the exception. With most other genocides, or all other genocides, you see the denial, you see the controversy, and we have to understand denial and controversy as part of genocide and not the other way around. So trying to break up, and I only will map very quickly other issues that are coming up when people talk about genocide. They are talking about hatred and racial hatred, which all of these may apply and may not apply to particular cases and are barriers to acknowledging what is happening. They are thinking about hatred. They are thinking about, some of them from the other hand, about war and self-defense and how does it relate to genocide. They are thinking about provocation. The idea is that genocide must be unprovoked, which is not the case if you look at other historical cases. Popular legitimation and support are extremely important and are part of genocide through the media, where media and political discourse are garnering support within the genocidal society, dehumanization, and controversy. Controversy and denial is part of genocide. So I want to, and of course the intent. So I want to suggest that some useful things we may do when we talk about genocide is not to look for perfect victims and perpetrator groups. So the idea is that since Jews have been victims of genocide, they cannot be, or simply cannot think of themselves as perpetrators. This is not true only for Jews, but also for other groups. We should not think or look for timeless or ahistorical truths about perpetrator and victim groups, and we should listen to each other with nuance and sensitivity to the knowledge and experience of people around us, and that we do not exceptionalize cases, although this is hard to do when you are in the midst of it. If we want to have allies, if we want to have more people with us, let's think about how not to exceptionalize. In my field, and I've been researching Palestinian prisoners in Israeli prisons for a long time. The incarceration, the mass incarceration of Palestinians is something that is not without parallel exactly where we live. Things that are going on right now with detention and torture of Palestinians are certainly not without parallel. In recent American history, we have the State Iman Detention Center and Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo. And for someone who's been studying Israeli torture for over 20 years, this time we have forced nudity and the use of dogs that has never happened before. And both of these things have happened in Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo. We see these forms moving across spaces and history. So the question of genocide is unfolding and controversial, and I hope we can get more allies with us through sensitive conversations, and not only through calling people out, but through calling them in, and let's keep talking. Thank you so much.
I'm sorry that we haven't had opportunity to ask questions and discuss, but we wanted to give the people on the panel the opportunity to speak and for us to think and absorb what we've heard here. It shouldn't be necessary to call people brave for giving a talk at a conference, but I'd like to thank the members of this panel in the current academic climate for being brave and speaking up. Thank you.